Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along. While you're all making yourselves comfortable, just to let you know, we've got interpretations in French and English today, should you need any translation. I'll just let you all settle down, and please take a seat as soon as you can. Welcome to this panel on land, livelihoods, and sustainable development. My name is Anya Sitharam, and I'm moderating the panel today. We're going to look at the global pressures on land and soil and the steps needed to address these to ensure a more sustainable use of soil and better land management. And we're going to discuss in particular the issues surrounding land and soil degradation. Those working in the area say that until recently, this has been a neglected crisis. However, it is now being addressed globally in discussions about sustainable development goals. World leaders have called for a land degradation neutral world. Now, we already know that 870 million people worldwide suffer from chronic hunger. Land degradation is going to prove a bigger challenge as the world population grows to 9 billion people. And the greatest impacts are felt in the poorest parts of the world, but it's also a problem in the EU where 500,000 contaminated sites exist and need clearing up. In a moment, we'll hear from our distinguished panelists, and I'll also be putting some questions to you to gauge your opinion. But first, we're going to take a look at a short film made for the Economics of Land Degradation
The Value of Soil. The value of soil. Soil is wonderful. Well, of course, we live on it. And if it is fertile, it can produce marvelous things. Fertile soil puts food on our plate, but the number of plates is growing, and more meat ends up on these plates. And part of what we previously put on our plates, we now put into our petrol tanks. This again requires more fertile soil. Productive land is becoming scarce. In 1960, there was still almost half a hectare of farmland for every person on Earth. In 2020, there will be only around a third of that left. Consequently, even unsuitable land is being turned into farmland. No wonder land grabbing is on the rise. Fertile soil is precious, but instead of looking after it, we try to extract the maximum yield from it. But overusing land or cultivating unsuitable land leads to soil degradation. We need healthy soil to produce crops and timber and store and purify water. Soil provides us and our environment with important ecosystem services. Degraded soil makes us vulnerable. Unsustainable land management is sometimes the result of ignorance, and it sometimes results from poverty, where land users have no other choice. Land degradation is driven by things like cutting down forests, overgrazing, monoculture, salination, overuse of fertilizers and chemicals, or farming on sloping ground leading to soil erosion. Not to forget climate change, which alters the drought and rain patterns. But not only does climate change contribute to soil degradation also worsens climate change because degraded soil can store less carbon. But why does all of this matter so much? Well, because it takes 2,000 years to generate about 10 centimeters of topsoil. That is a long time. Soil is a practically non-renewable resource whose overexploitation is costing us dearly. For example, Niger loses approximately 8% of its gross domestic product to overgrazing and excessive salinity in rice paddy fields. Solving these problems through sustainable land management would save 2/3 of this money. Globally, soil degradation is an expensive business. Already it costs every person on Earth $70 each year, which in total is about $490 billion. To this, one needs to add the indirect costs of environmental and humanitarian disasters, such as water shortages, yield shortfalls, or dust storms. The consequence is damage to health, forced migration, famine, and eventually conflict. But how can we prevent this? First of all, it is very difficult to take all these possible consequences into account in planning processes because it is so hard to recognize the true costs of our inaction. With the right figures, we could make the right decisions. We have to include the value of the soil services and the cost of land degradation into our calculation. Then it becomes obvious that using soils in the way that most of us do today is simply not economically viable in the long run. To solve this problem, we set up the Economics of Land Degradation Initiative, ELD. We want to find out more about these actual costs by bringing together scientists, decision makers in politics and industry, and local land users. And we want to take a global approach. How high are the costs of inaction? What are the potential benefits of adopting sustainable land management practices? What needs to be done? Land degradation has to stop. Knowledge about the costs must be passed on and become part of the decision-making processes. Sustainable land management isn't free, but in the long term it is the much cheaper option. It is the only way to preserve one of mankind's most precious assets, the wonderful, fertile soil.
That's the value of soil and the economic costs of not managing land properly. Now, before we hear from our speakers, I'm going to ask you a few questions. In some of the other debates you've been to, you may have been asked to vote on your mobile phones. We're going to do it in a much more old-fashioned way, and I'm going to get you to raise your hands. So I've got 3 questions for you. I'll read them out a couple of times, and I will give you options when to vote. So I'll read out a question first with the options, and then I will get you to raise your hands accordingly. So we heard there about land degradation. Land degradation and desertification is A, a local or regional issue that is best addressed by national governments, or B, an issue affecting vulnerable populations globally that requires strong, coordinated international action to address it. You can only raise your hands for one, not for both, if you think you agree with both, but you've got to choose one. So, those of you who think land degradation and desertification is a local or regional issue best addressed by national governments, please raise your hands. Right, 1 person, okay. 2, all right, thank you, well spotted. B, an issue affecting vulnerable populations globally that requires strong international action. Please raise your hands. Overwhelmingly in favor of international action. The second question, land degradation and desertification is primarily a result of A, deforestation, B, climate change, and C, poor agricultural practices. Those of you who think land degradation is caused by deforestation, raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. About 10, okay? Those of you who think it's caused by climate change, 1. Okay, and those of you who think it's caused by poor agricultural practices, okay. And lastly, question number 3, the social and economic impacts of land degradation are more immediate and more significant than climate change and biodiversity loss. Those who think that the social and economic impacts are more immediate and more significant than climate change and biodiversity loss, raise your hands. Right, and those who think it isn't, raise your hands. Right, okay. So most of you think, again, that it's more significant. Well, I'm going to bring in the panel for that, to react to that. Let me just introduce them very quickly. On my furthest right, we've got Alexander Müller from the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies, Duncan Pruitt, who's advisor on land rights from Oxfam International. On my left, Luke Gnacha, who's Gnachacha, I've got your name right, sorry, sir, who is from the Executive Secretary for the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. And on my far left, Martin Dahinden from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. I'm going to start with Luke. First of all, what do you think of what the audience here came up with? The fact that they thought that, interestingly enough, that the social and economic impacts of land degradation are more immediate and more significant than climate change.
Well, they're right. It is more immediate, but at the same time, it is a slow onset crisis. That's why government may I say, not well equipped to address it, because land degradation is a slow process. And when it happens at the local level. It affects, firstly, local population, including not only on the output of the agriculture, but also on water resources. And even beyond, it affects people by entrenching them into poverty, for instance. But at the same time, it is global, and it is compounded by climatic factors. It is also compounded, or you can measure it by the loss of biodiversity. So, yes, I believe that, unfortunately, not only that it is local, but it's also global, and we need at the global level to ensure that we take appropriate action. Let me give you maybe briefly 7 reasons why we should. First, land is the essential natural capital in the nexus of food, energy, and water. If we want to ensure access to all to food, energy, and water, we must ensure that we sustainably manage the land. Second, globally speaking, poverty is rural. And because it is rural, and it's often about decreasing yield in degraded land, and at the same time, if you map hunger, you will see that those who are part of this 870 million people going hungry every day, most of them are in the rural areas depending on subsistence agriculture. So the best way to take them out of both poverty and hunger is to sustainably fill the yield gap. And the third point is about gender equality and gender empowerment. If we really want to ensure that rural people in the rural areas, especially women depending on the land, that they will make it sustainably in their livelihood, we must ensure that they have secure access to land and to investment to their activities. All those numbers are available, even inclusive growth. In the land-based economies, when you consider what degradation means loss of productivity. But at the same time, sustainable use or sustainable land management means bringing the loss of productivity back. I call degraded land underperforming asset. And what you do with your underperforming asset actually is that you attend to the issue and you bring the underperforming asset back to full performance. And that's certainly the way of addressing growth in the developing countries. And the 3 other points are for the youth. The potential for job creation in the developing world is largely in agriculture and, of course, in industries related to processing agricultural output. Resilience to climatic shocks. It's again about land. When you think about drought, for instance, drought is another crisis that we do not see as a major disaster because drought is not charismatic, so to say. Drought does not come roaring like other disasters. But as a matter of fact, drought is having more socioeconomic impact than all the other disasters pulled together. And the way to build resilience to drought is, again, to sustainably manage the land. And finally, if we think about human security, ensuring that we reduce the push factor for migration from the rural areas, again, it is about sustainable management of the land. So those 7 reasons actually should bring us to center stage sustainable land management in the post-2015 development agenda.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring in Duncan Pruitt from Oxfam International there. What did you make of the results of that poll?
Is this working? Yeah. Well, I was struck by the fact that people all seem to broadly agree on the answers. The clear choice for the importance of the sort of social and economic factors or impacts, I can't remember exactly what the question was, resonates with the approach that we've taken as Oxfam International on the land issue. And I think, sadly, although the environmental impacts are also very significant, very often we're seeing the social impacts emerge first and in quite a dramatic way. I actually wish that the introductory film had run on for a little longer, and it could have discussed how exactly those people sitting around the table together were going to find the solutions, because just having a multi-stakeholder dialogue is only the first step.
Carry on, please carry on, yeah.
So our approach as Oxfam is to come into this discussion about land not so much from the perspective of land degradation, but from looking at this debate around land grabbing and large-scale land acquisition and the related issues of governance of land. We're a rights-based organization, and so when we're looking at this pressure that's growing on land and natural resources, we're looking at how it's undermining land rights and how it threatens people's right to self-determination and to development. And although that's not directly about land degradation, the subject of this panel, I think that everyone would agree that if people have secure land tenure, they're more likely to take care of their land and ensure that it is not degraded. So this focus that we've taken, not about deforestation necessarily, not about pollution, we've aimed to focus on something which we feel is highly emblematic. If a company, often aided by a government, is ignoring human rights abuses in its investments, is making false promises to local communities, is creating conflicts over land, the land that it's acquiring, then there's a good chance that it probably also doesn't care about the environment and doesn't care about how the soil is going to be treated. And in 2011, when we came into this debate, we looked at the policies out there and found there were lots of very impressive and very responsible policies in place. So what was the problem? The problem was that in reality, land was still a blind spot for many people. The 60% of the complaints that go to the World Bank's ombudsman for private sector investments are about land. We see that the #2 reason for human rights defenders to be killed in the line of their work is around land. There are a couple of thousand land conflicts going on in Indonesia at the moment. There are a rising number of land conflicts going on in Brazil at the moment. You can look all this stuff up. And what we're also finding is that certified plantations around the world are getting those certificates in spite of the fact that they've got ongoing land conflicts and they're effectively land grabs. So it's a pretty depressing picture, and all of that's going on against the backdrop of weak land tenure. 70% of the developing world population is outside formal land registers, and poor rural populations are often the most at risk. So when we're talking about land and land use, we're talking about a very political subject. There's a lot of hostility at times, a lot of entrenched interests, which are profiting from the weak governance and weak land tenure arrangements. And I would say there are probably tens of thousands of dramas going on in tens of thousands of local contexts. So it is a globally important issue which needs global responses, but actually it's also very local and always requires the two sides to work together. We're big fans of the voluntary guidelines on land tenure, which my fellow panelist, Alexander, was involved in the development of, produced by the Committee on Food Security in Rome in 2012. And I would really plea that the monitoring of the implementation of these guidelines and the strengthening of land tenure become a key indicator in the post-2015 framework, also to help halt land degradation. So I've got one last little bit I wanted to bring in. So of course, one side of it is the need to improve land governance, but we all know that that's like a development agenda in itself. And it's not something which is going to get solved overnight. And in the meantime, we need to think about what else needs to be happening. Now, from the civil society perspective, I believe that civil society organizations need to be allowed to do their work and not banned. And they should be supported in their watchdog role and not harassed, because that's very often, as many know, what happens. From the private sector perspective, okay, we're all for more private sector investment. And of course, it's increasingly being relied upon as a development partner, but it also needs to accept responsibility in that process. But the news of land grabbing that keeps coming back into the media again and again is infuriating. I just read this morning that a third of Papua New Guinea is taken up by concessions for logging, purportedly for palm oil plantations afterwards, although we doubt whether the palm oil plantations will ever actually materialize. And it goes on in spite of a government commission that said it should stop, because the government suddenly decided that it's not going to listen to the, I don't know if there's anyone from Papua New Guinea here, but if so, maybe we can hear more about that. Oxfam's recent experience is that we decided to rate the world's 10 biggest food and beverage companies on their performance on a whole range of issues related to food. And one of the themes inside that was land, and we used 50 indicators to rate each company on how they're doing on land. A third of those indicators were not just on land rights, but were on land degradation. We focused on the sugar sector, and I think it's worth noting, thinking about which crops are driving land degradation. Sugar sector covers 31 million hectares of the world, it is estimated. Soy is 100 million, palm oil is 15 million. All of these are set to rise a lot because of the rising demands. And it's a very disappointing picture. The companies score really low in terms of what they're doing to address land issues. We're very proud to say that Coca-Cola, which is the world's biggest sourcer of sugar, has actually been the first company that we know of to commit to a zero-tolerance policy on land grabbing. And we really hope that other companies will follow its lead in that. I have some information about how the companies score specifically on land degradation, but I think I'm running out of time.
Well, just very quickly, tell us the top and the bottom, and then we can talk about that later.
Okay. I did some arithmetic this morning, because looking just at the land degradation indicators, biodiversity, deforestation, and etc. And the top one is, as it is overall, is Nestlé. So a Swiss company, a Swiss-based company, you'll be happy to hear. The bottom one is Kellogg's. So you think about that when you're eating your cornflakes in the morning. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Well, that's public knowledge, but it is hot off the press, so that's new information there. Is anyone here from the private sector at all? Like to hear from you? No, no one. So we're going to just bash the private sector. Fair enough. All right, let's hear now from Martin Dahinden. Interestingly enough, Martin, that everyone thought that land degradation is an international issue more than a national issue.
Yes, but I have to say that your questions were a little bit tricky. I would have said yes, probably, to almost all the questions. And so you pushed the people under pressure and gave them only one choice per question. I believe it's both. And this is one of the typical issues of land degradation, that it is so complex and has so many ramifications. So you need local action, you need international action, and you need also to realize that land degradation is not a narrow technical issue. It has to deal with almost anything else we are dealing with in development cooperation. For instance, with climate, with food security, with biodiversity, with water, with migration, with conflict. So all those issues are coming together, and I think we should be aware that when we are trying to find solutions, we need to have a comprehensive and not only, let's say, a technical approach to those issues. And both previous statements pointed many of those things out. Now, I'm very happy that the issue is here on the table. I'm convinced that it has not enough public attention in international discussion than it should have, and I hope this event and what will follow will help for this. Now the question is, what does a development agency like SDC in this area? And here I want to underline a little bit what are the lines of action we think are useful to contribute to the solution of the problem. And of course, we know that we will only make a small contribution to solve things. One first lesson we have drawn during the past years is that we need knowledge and we need also schemes to disperse knowledge. This is one of the reasons why we have a quite significant investment in agricultural research. I think this is probably more important in this area than in many of the other areas where development cooperation agencies are active in. The second issue, and this makes also reference to what has previously been said, is the importance of land governance, of strengthening land governance. We have been active for some decades in various countries where we are running programs for rural development. We have gained experience how should land governance, and here of course on a global level, but then also when it comes to land grabbing, be best organized. And the voluntary guidelines on responsible agricultural investments, of course, is something where we fed in our experience and something we think we should push. A third element is the agriculture that is important for poor people is mainly a family type of agriculture. These are not huge exploitation, and therefore we have followed a policy where we are strengthening smallholders. And I think this is something that should be much more recognized in future policies on a worldwide level, but also on a country level. And this means also that we do not let the smallholders behind and focus, for instance, in agricultural research only on the big production facilities, to put it like this. And then, of course, a fourth element that is important, it is an everlasting topic, is a policy coherence for development. It's about agricultural policies in OECD countries, including in Switzerland, where we need to do more scrutiny and to look more closer than we did in the past, what will be the effect of our own agricultural policy on the farmers in countries in the south, and what is the effect, of course, on the land degradation. So this is in a nutshell about the 4 lines of activities. I agree that it is a global issue, even so it has a local component. And what is important, of course, now, and I get this out of the vote of the audience, is that we need a global action and we need a global attention for the problem much more than it has been the past decades or 2 decades.
Thank you very much. Alexander Müller, one of the results of that poll, even though people might have agreed with everything, but they did seem to overwhelmingly say that land degradation was due to poor agricultural practices. Would you agree?
This is not a big surprise. The microphones didn't start working because I would like to say this is not a big surprise. We know it. That's nothing really new. But we should not focus only on agriculture because the reality on the ground is driven by a lot of other factors. And that's what I would like to do. I would like to try to provide 3 answers. The first answer is, what is the current situation with regard to land and soils at the political agenda, very briefly. Second, looking at the drivers of land degradation, we should not underestimate that there are vested interests behind. It's not just happening out of the blue. And then third, I would like to look at why soils are so important if we solve the problems ahead of us. So if we look at the current situation, I think I would like to start with a positives. We have soils now at the global agenda. This did not happen years before. Our friend Luc was very successful in putting a land degradation neutral world in the Rio+20 outcome. But now we have to do some very concentrated work to keep it in and to have a development, a sustainable development goal related to land and soils. If we don't put pressure on the negotiations, it will fall out again. And therefore we have an opportunity now, but we have to carefully strategize what we have to do. And one of the things where I'm really not happy about is the situation. My own country, Germany, is opposing the soil directive of the European Union because we don't have a problem in Europe. That's absolutely wrong. We have problems with soils in Europe, and land degradation is not only an issue of the developing countries. And this sends a very wrong political signal. Because if the European Union doesn't want to deal in a comprehensive way with its soils, why should we ask the African countries to do it? And therefore, I think we have to have a political debate to put soils higher on the political agenda. The second issue is, what are the drivers of degradation? And here I think we are in a very strange situation. Land and soils are undervalued at the political agenda. On the other hand, a lot of money is invested in lands and soil. As a result of the financial crisis, a lot of money is circulating around the world looking for investment, and land is one of the preferred investments. And there, I think we have to find a way that the voluntary guidelines already mentioned by my colleagues are really applied in the countryside. The voluntary guidelines for the first time provide an internationally agreed set of norms and principles with regard to responsible land governance. But this is also, again, not only an issue of developing countries. We could also consider that in the developed world, industry, that they have to take into account the situation in the land in the south where they are investing. There is an intensive debate on the exterritorial obligations of international companies with regard to human rights. Why shouldn't we request the companies here in the developed world to respect fully the voluntary guidelines when it comes to investment in the developing world? We cannot ask poor countries to fully implement the voluntary guidelines without any support, and our companies, from the developed world, are coming with a lot of money, investing there, and without respecting their extraterritorial obligations. My third issue is, I was a bit unhappy with the question you raised in the beginning. What is more important, land degradation or climate change? Because this gives, from my perspective, a wrong alternative. If we are looking at the challenges ahead of us, the climate change negotiations, if we want to protect biodiversity, if we want to achieve food security, and, we have to include soils in all of the negotiations. And this is, from my point of view, a thing which went very wrong over the last years. The climate change negotiations were only dealing with carbon or CO2. Biodiversity, they are counting species. Food security, I was part of the problem, we're dealing with kilocalories. But we did not look at the natural resources as the basis to achieve development. Natural resources as a basis to achieve food security for all. And therefore, we have to consider soils as one of the real cross-cutting issues to be involved in all of these global negotiations. Without healthy soils, we will not stop climate change, we will not achieve a biodiverse world, and we will not achieve food security. And therefore, it's not the question what is more important, the question should be how can we ensure that soils are treated in an appropriate way in all these different global negotiations.
Just following up on that last comment of yours, do you think in that case, if there is an SDG on soil in particular, what kind of target should there be? What kind of measurement should there be?
We should be very pragmatic. We have currently this very nice sentence, we, the heads of states who have agreed to it, strive to achieve a land degradation neutral world in the framework of sustainable development. And we should analyze this sentence and we should develop indicators. And in the last Global Soil Week, which was held in Berlin only a few weeks ago, we had a group of experts sitting together trying to analyze what does it mean, a land degradation neutral world? Because this is one of the phrases which can be used easily without having any implications. And therefore, we should break it down. We should set very clear targets. For example, one of the targets could be that in 2030, we will have the same amount of productive land and the same amount of ecosystem services as we had in 2000, so that at global scale we have an indicator to stop land degradation. And of course we know that urbanization is increasing, so that more land will be sealed, and therefore we have to invest heavily in land restoration. So land degradation neutral world also means investing in land restoration. But land restoration is a tricky issue, because currently poor people are living on degraded land. What is happening to poor people if large-scale investment is going on to restore land? And therefore, we have to have a human rights approach. We have to apply the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of land, so that in the end, poor people are not the losers of investment in land restoration. And if we are continuing to work on this set of sub-targets for a land degradation neutral world, we can prove that it is doable, but we can also present the implications if we do it in a wrong way. And therefore, let's work on a set of sub-targets and indicators for a land degradation neutral world. Let's try to convince our governments, and let's make very clear that this is an investment in the future. In the beginning, it might need some more investment, but in future, we will earn a lot of profit on it.
Thank you. Luke, you do a lot of work with land restoration, but is the idea of restoring land to the productivity to its 2000 level, is that realistic?
It's realistic, it is feasible, it is within reach. In fact, neutrality is not the aim. The aim is to restore more than we degrade. So agreeing on a clear target or a clear deadline where we will reach neutrality, which means we will match degradation by restoration, is just to give to ourselves a kind of tipping point where we will all converge through action. There are good news. I have seen in the world at grassroots level, initiatives which are quite astonishing regarding restoration. Let me give one example. In Niger, where you have heard that degradation through overgrazing is costing the nation up to 8% of the agricultural GDP, it is in the film. The point is, what will Niger do to reverse it? But there have been something expert has labeled or called farmer-managed natural regeneration. And in the last 2 decades or so, from the grassroots level, because they have no other option, they have restored some 5 million hectares of land through farmer-managed natural regeneration, which is about ensuring that they care for naturally regenerated trees in a way that, of course, enhance the soil, enhance, therefore, access to fodder for the livestock, enhance water availability. So the point is, how are we going to scale this up? how are we going to scale it up? Why is it that public policies and investment are failing those type of initiatives from the grassroots level? Why is it that scaling up is such a challenge? What are the type of investment and the policy needed? I think those are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. And the private sector is likely to play a bigger role. When I say private sector, please don't be mistaken. I also mean smallholder farmers, because they are investors too. When a country is actually assessing his investment, he should count the farmers, the smallholder farmers, as part of the investors. And when it's about building a conducive framework for investors, government should also look at farmers as investors.
Alexander, did you want to come in?
I would like to support Luc, that's not surprising, that it is feasible. And I think there are some steps we can do immediately. And I would like to present one example. You might have heard it that currently 1/3 of all food being produced is being thrown away. If you translate this into natural resources, if you consider food waste at global scale as a country, it would be the 3rd biggest emitter in the world. If you look at the water footprint of food waste, it's 250 cubic kilometers every year. That's 3 times the size of Lake Geneva. And this is about 1/3 of all land being used for agriculture. So if we are changing not only consumption patterns, but the way we are dealing with food, we would have immediately an impact on land and land degradation. And therefore, this is one of my key issues. It's not only about poor people living on degraded land, it's also how we are changing our consumption patterns and how we are dealing with the natural resources here in our society.
Thank you. Before I open it out to the floor, I just wanted to pick up on a point that Martin made, and you may want to pick up on that as well, just about the idea of passing on knowledge schemes.
Passing on what?
Knowledge schemes and agricultural research, knowledge practices.
I mean, I will try to give you a brief answer, but actually I wanted to take the floor to respond to what Alex said. I mean, one of the difficult issues is, to some extent, that we are developing knowledge that works on a, let's say, pilot level scheme. But then the problem comes how we can multiply it. And I think this is probably the challenge lying ahead. How do we upscale what works on a smaller level? And there I think policies or innovation in social and economic behavior is something we should definitely look more at. It's not so much, in my view, the technical innovation that is in the center of the issue. But I wanted to come back to an issue Alex Müller has raised. Food waste. I mean, we have a lot of food waste on both sides. There is a lot of food wasted, to put lost in developing countries because the storage facility, transport facilities are not there. And then in the OECD countries, in the countries of the north, half of the food roughly is thrown away. Now, with the discussion on sustainable development goals, with the post-2015 agenda, we have an interesting paradigm change that helps us to capture those issues. If you look back at the Millennium Development Goals, it was first very much concentrated only on poverty, without putting emphasis on economic and ecological issues, and it was very much a look to countries in the south, to poor people and to poor countries. Now, with the Sustainable Development Goals, there is a paradigm shift. First, all the 3 pillars of sustainability should be reflected, and then it is not only about what happens in the countries of the south, but it's also about the behavior and behavioral changes of the countries in the north. And I think if we want to come up with meaningful solutions for issues like land degradation, it is a chance to have now to deal with a concept with a quite broad paradigm and to put our policies in there. And therefore, I think it's the right time to give a strong push to the topic in the context of the now ongoing discussions in the post-2015 agenda. But of course, I would also agree with the opinion that it is not something you can look in a silo-like manner. It has to deal a lot what is going on in other processes than the post-2015 process, for instance, in the trade negotiations or in the climate discussions.
Okay, before we carry on discussing, which we could at length here, I'd like to bring in some questions from the floor. And I know we have one question already from Simon van der Leer. There you are. Can you bring the microphone to him? He's a youth ambassador and has a couple of questions for the panel.
Thank you very much. Hello? Yeah, does it work? Thank you very much for this interesting debate. I just would like first to thank Simon. I'm from SENSE, the Student Network for Sustainability. And I would like to thank all of the people and the students looking at us today online, and especially the group in India who worked extensively on this debate and brainstormed and find ideas. We had a question to raise to the whole panelists on basically looking back at the past decade and asking you about the progress made on the commitments in '96 on the World Food Summit, where more than 180 head states decided to reduce by half the number of undernourished people by 2015, and the role that soil degradation played in it. I also would like to highlight that in 2009, the FAO stated that $44 billion were necessary to eradicate poverty, and today governments are failing to provide this support, which is a small amount if you would compare it with the OECD subsidies granted to agriculture, which are more than over $365 billion. Yeah, thank you.
Who would like to respond to that question first? Luc?
Thank you. I would like to take on the issue of subsidies. Subsidies are distorting the market, and if we were to just summarize the drivers of degradation, they are of twofold. One is poverty, the other one is market failures. So subsidies are adding to those distortions, and subsidies are on both sides, on the developing countries and on the developed countries. Let me give you an example of a developing country. I come from a country where the major cash crop is cotton. And in the past decade, government has been increasing subsidies in fertilizers just to increase the output in cotton production. But it hasn't worked. The output has flattened and the subsidies have doubled. Of course, there are some vested interests. Some of the middlemen has made more money, but in fact, this has ended up in more degradation. The question is, how could the government use those subsidies better in attending to land and soil in a way that will increase production sustainably and we take people out of poverty? Is possible. It's feasible. It just calls on people to think out of the box. So that's what I believe. Governments are giving excuses. One of the excuses you hear here and there, including in developed countries, is economic and financial crisis. But the crisis is an opportunity to look for how efficient we could be in using investment. And when you look at soil and the best way to use it, it is about efficiency in using those investments. So I could elaborate on that further, but I really believe that the opportunity to have an SDG on land is very crucial if we really don't want to fail this opportunity of bringing land as a global common into consideration. By 2030, we will need to match an increase of food by plus 40 to 50%, plus 45% in energy, plus 30% in water. All this will claim more land. Some 175 million hectares of land may be needed. Where are we going to take them? We're likely to continue taking them on existing forest. What is the alternative? Ensuring that through sound policies from the global level to the local level, that not only we will reduce the demand and the pressure on land, but we'll also, whenever needed, rather look at land which still hold potential for restoration. And in this, let me conclude this by saying there are two ongoing initiatives which could be, may I say, connected. One is the global forest and landscape restoration, which is spearheaded by institutions like IUCN, and is supported by what is being called the global challenge, the bond challenge, where government has made commitment to restore. This could be connected with the economics of land degradation, where potential for restoration at country level will be clearly mapped, and therefore policies to ensure that effort or investment are channeled towards restoration of those land will help.
Okay, thank you. I think the question was specifically about how we're doing regarding that commitment, though, to the World Food Summit in 1996, where we want to try and reduce the number of undernourished people to less than 400,000 by 2015. Alexander, do you know where we are on that?
Yes, I know it, and I would like to thank you for your question, because the question really highlights that it is important to carefully formulate the targets. And if we are looking back, we can see that we had two targets. The Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, wanted to reduce the percentage of hungry people by 50%, and we are close to achieving it. And the World Food Summit targets was to reduce the number of hungry people by 50%. And here we are far away from achieving it. And I can give you the figures. Some years ago, we had about 1 billion people being hungry, and now we have 870 million people being hungry. And the World Food Summit target was to reduce the number of hungry people to 450 million. So we are far above. But the MDG target we will achieve, because population growth was faster than the number of hungry people, and therefore a growing population allows us to say we will achieve the MDGs because we have reduced the percentage of hungry people. When it comes to the SDGs, we should really consider what do we want to achieve. For me, we are in a very bad situation because, for example, in Africa, the absolute number of hungry people has increased over the last 15 years. I have the figures in front of me. 1990, we had around 170 million people being hungry, and currently it's 226 million people. So it's slightly increasing, but population growth is faster, and therefore the percentage, we are coming close to achieve the MDGs. With regard to land, we have to learn the lesson. We should not talk only about percentages. We have to look in absolute numbers what we are going to achieve. And this is the challenge when it comes transforming the MDGs into a post-2015 development agenda and into sustainable development goals. We have to have very clear indicators. Otherwise, it can happen that the number of hungry people in Africa is increasing, and we consider this as a success because the percentage is going down.
Duncan Pruitt, you wanted to come in there. I think you need. Have you got a microphone that works? Yes.
Yeah, you told me yesterday that I was possibly the pessimist on the panel. I don't know that particular statistic about the 40 billion that was needed, but over the last since I've been in Oxfam, which is 8 years, I've seen us challenge governments to make good on one promise after another about spending. The one I remember most is the ones made by the G8 in L'Aquila in Italy in, I think, 2008. But the reality is that our optimism that those promises get fulfilled goes down and down and down. And with the financial crisis, there's less and less money available, public money available to fulfill these kinds of promises. And what we've seen is an increasing reliance on the private sector, obviously. And so there's I feel like to a certain extent there's it's great that there's optimism. We have to talk about how things should be. But the challenge is to realize that the situation at the moment doesn't look rosy. It looks like, the pressure on land is extractive. The reality is it's extractive. And when Luke talks about the need for an indicator which restores degraded land and prevents land being degraded, I think that it's really easy to talk about scaling up models to restore land, and that's great and inspiring. But the problem is, at the same time, as I mentioned in the case of, for example, Papua New Guinea, but there's many other places, the reality is that the land is being degraded, I guess, much, much faster than it can possibly be restored. And so any discussion about what needs to happen needs to look at how to give people, communities, smallholder farmers the chance to defend their land, to give them the chance to develop in their own way, in the way that they choose, and not hope that basically the private sector is going to come and solve it for them. Oxfam is absolutely for private sector investment, and we have discussions with the private sector about what good investment is. But at the moment, we're a long, long way from good investment in many, many cases. And we're really concerned that unless that reality check is taken on board, that we'll end up doing some kind of, some important work around the edges, but not dealing with this massive elephant in the room, which is that the incentives are there right now to extract value from the soil, value from the land, and poor rural communities are just kind of seen as standing in the way of that.
Thank you. Simon, do you want to come back on that? Do you have one more question?
I would like to also to bring the questions of youth migration from the rural to urban areas. There are many factors that you already mentioned, and so I want to hear from you what are the solutions and how youth can be included into like a strategy for agriculture, and maybe set a new kind of entrepreneurs for agriculture. So what are your views on this, and what are possible solutions?
Luke.
Yes. Ensuring that you have secure access to land, to information and extension services, and this will certainly help youth to be part of what we're calling for the revolution, whereby we will have a clear land stewardship context in place. And when you look at the developing countries, it's where the potential for job creation, to contribute to poverty alleviation and to food security is the largest. So ensuring that youth are trained, that they have access, secure access to land and have access to investment and resources is certainly part of the solution.
Thank you. Any more questions? Please raise your hands. There was a lady there. I'm going to take two so that we've got quite a few, so I'll take two, the lady there and the lady in front of her, and then we'll answer those.
Thank you. My name is Laura Sullivan. I represent an NGO called ActionAid here in Brussels. There's a lot of people from the private sector here in these couple of days, more from the multinational end than the smallholder farmer end of the private sector spectrum, and a lot are looking for solutions to the question, how do we do corporate social responsibility? And yet we're told today about the issue of land grabbing by major corporates in the developing world. So I just wonder, there's obviously a problem here in the sense that we are talking a lot about individual great projects, but then not looking at bigger structural issues of land grabbing that is affecting tens and hundreds and thousands of people at a time. So just wonder, a question to the panel, and particularly to Duncan Pruitt, what would you say specifically the private sector should now be doing beyond the example that was given about actually implementing and going along the voluntary guidelines? If I may also very quickly, what advice for the European Union, given that there's a lot of people running around wondering how are we going to implement a human rights-based approach in our programming and in the developing world in general through our policies, yet, as was mentioned, policy coherence for development is at a far way from being accomplished. So what specific sort of advice do you have for the European Union in terms of policy coherence for development, land, and particularly land grabs? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Take the question there from the lady just there with her hand up.
Hi, my name is Simone Ansbach from the in London. Sorry, excuse me. So the European Parliament Committee on Development has issued a draft report on the role of property rights in development that I'm sure the panel is aware. And we have responded saying that customary land rights and customary land use is not really regarded and addressed in that draft report. So I wanted to hear the panel's views on the role of customary land rights and also how you're working with the European Commission and also in your programs to address these issues, which are especially important in Africa. So thank you.
Okay, I'll just take one more question so that we can think. There's a gentleman over there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for an interesting panel. My name is Craig Fagan. I work with Transparency International. And I wanted to come into a question or a point that was raised around land governance that was mentioned by the director of the Swiss Development Corporation, and to raise it to him as well as the whole panel. How are you seeing corruption affecting these issues? Because we work in 100 countries around the world, and we have from our chapters from Argentina to Zambia to Uganda to Eastern Europe and Central Asia saying that they see this as a key problem and that this is affecting not only the land issue but also the environmental issue, especially as we see more energy and efforts put into this. And the follow-up question would be is, how do we then address this issue as part of the post-2015 framework? If there is a goal on land, how would you suggest that we bring in this issue of governance, corruption, and the positives of transparency and accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. Right, first of all, Duncan, let's get you to address the question about what advice there should be for the private sector.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Laura, for that one. I think, well, there's probably lots to be said. So one of course, the thing about land governance is more about getting governments to implement changes which give people the chance to protect themselves, and that's really vital. But what we're calling for at the moment with towards the private sector, and that's why I mentioned Coca-Cola, is we're calling for companies to effectively say that they will not tolerate land grabbing in their supply chains. And indeed, there can be a flavour of that for investors too. There can be a flavour of that towards large agribusiness firms. We started with the food and beverage companies because they are buying their products from the huge trading companies like Cargill and Bunge, etc. So we have the same ask to everyone, and it's out there in the public already. Within that, there are, by the way, points about transparency which are really vital, because in the extent to which a company actually is transparent about how it's sourcing, where it is sourcing from, it is possible for them to be held accountable by their consumers, by the communities who are producing the products which are eventually used by the companies. And that's another area where if you look at the commitments that we've got from Coke, I don't want to be an advertisement for Coke, but it's pretty groundbreaking what they've committed to. Advice to the EU, I guess there's lots of pieces of advice to the EU, but knowing what you're working on, I assume that you're partly thinking about the biofuels mandates. The EU's policies in this area, we believe, as does ActionAid and many others, are causing fluctuations in food prices, driving land use change, leading to land grabbing, etc. And there's a big push at the moment to put pressure on the European Union to do something about it. But it's a very hard-fought battle, and the private sector is fighting back extremely strongly. May I also answer about community land rights briefly? Yes. Because I haven't actually read that report, or I've heard rumors about it. I just didn't have time to read it. It really is terrible if customary land rights and community land rights are not addressed. we've just organized a big conference, actually hosted by SDC in Switzerland, Oxfam, along with Rights and Resources and the International Land Coalition, focusing purely on community land rights and how to scale up efforts to strengthen those land rights. One of the things that the conference developed as a kind of consensus outcome was that we needed to push for the doubling of the amount of land, the doubling of the amount of community land which is legally recognized by 2018. And what I'm quite pleased to say is that kind of agenda and that commitment to community land rights is also part of the work of an expert group which is now developing indicators on land governance as a way to help monitor the voluntary guidelines implementation, but also to possibly as an indicator for the post-2015 framework. So we've definitely got a game plan there. Martin.
Thank you very much. Of course, as Swiss, I have not come to Brussels to give the European Union an advice, but I have some points that refer to the questions that have been asked. I mean, the challenge is how do we get there where land grabbing doesn't take place or where we can reduce land degradation. And I think what we need is some sort of a multi-layer approach. One is corporate social responsibility. This has been mentioned. Companies like Coca-Cola, companies like Nestle depend also on their public image. Consumers can put a pressure, and so they have a genuine interest that human rights violation or ecological degradation and so on is not linked to their core business. And this is a strong driver, and I think one should not underestimate the role of the consumers and of the citizens. This is, of course, not the case for all business, but it is in the interest of the big companies that a series of negative things do not happen. And then comes the second layer. It is basically also a national responsibility of the countries concerned, be it a developing country or an industrialized country, to come up with legislations and with the right kind of policies that avoid those negative effects. And there, of course, in many places, corruption is an important role. We could probably have several, let's say, round tables to discuss about corruption. But of course, if the rules that have been set are not respected or are traded, you will not be very successful in pursuing your policy objectives. And therefore, I think it is of the utmost importance that in a new development agenda, corruption is addressed. It will be first difficult to be addressed at all. It should be there. And it will, of course, be much more difficult to come up with the right targets and with the right indicators. But it is sure that if we do not address this element, the goals themselves will not be as effective as we wish them to be.
Well, I want to get two more questions, and I know both panel want to come in. So just very quickly, Alexander.
Thanks a lot. For me, it's very clear. If you want to bring together sustainable land management and eradication of poverty, we have to put community-owned land in the center. And if you, again, look in the voluntary guidelines, you can see there is strong language in it, what has to be done in order to respect customary land rights. The second issue, when we started these negotiations on the voluntary guidelines, we had asked Transparency International to put into their global survey the question of corruption with regard to land. And it ranked very, very high, as far as I remember, on place 2 in their global survey. And we published it, and I got a lot of very negative feedback from member countries because we named the member countries. And that's very, very clear. We have to put corruption on the agenda. But, and this is my last sentence, corruption is happening in both developed and developing countries. It's not only the people taking the money, it's also the companies giving the money. And here I see a very clear responsibility of the European Union, of the industrialized world, to put pressure on companies, not only in the framework of corporate social responsibility, to respect every legal provision so that corruption is not part of the everyday deal.
I saw 2 hands go up over there. Can you, lady at the front? And any more questions? Got time for 2. Right, 1. Okay, and the lady there. Yep.
Hi.
It's working.
Hi. Gretchen Walters from IUCN. We do agree that restoration is a partial answer to land degradation, so thanks, Luke, for bringing that up. But I wanted to go back to some of the private sector issues. What about some of the cross-sector competitions for land in the north and its impact on the south, and what that does for land degradation? Could the panel give us some recommendations on how they would see that we could have this approach? At IUCN, with the FAO and UNEP, we're scoping to have a biomass platform that's worldwide, that's global, but to complement the EU bioeconomy panel. But we're just the beginning of that, so we'd really like your advice.
Okay, and one more question there. Lady in the purple. Who'd like to answer that one?
Thank you. My name is Cristiane. I'm from Brazil. And I just wanted to focus on the first 2 points you raised about food and fuel. As you know, Brazil has roughly 80% of the food produced in Brazil comes from the family farming. And what we see is that although now we have a lot of financial resources focused on that, especially the policy since Lula, we have a lack of knowledge and technical assistance for the growth of this food. So it goes from the abusive use of agrochemicals, which leads to the contamination and deforestation and other things. So on this point of view, on this side, I would like to hear from you, which are the tools that we as a civil society organizations can do to help on this development of land without having these problems, of course, of deforestation and contamination. And the other part about the land grabbing and corruption you're talking about, we saw since 2008, with the economic crisis in Brazil and the biofuels community, we have a lot of international companies buying land in Brazil to produce sugarcane. So my question is, which are the tools we could use to assure that we have sustainable development, as you say, in the land issues? Because we have certification, but we know it's not bulletproof for everything. So that's my question for you. Thank you.
Luke, or Martin, what should they do about lack of knowledge and technical assistance when it comes to trying to restore land?
Well, I think we need to ensure universal access to a kind of repository of good practices regarding land. That universal access will help any stakeholders from anywhere in the world to also check what might be the options, what is being done elsewhere successfully, and how they could learn from this. There have been a decision taken last September in Namibia at the UNCCD, United Nations Convention on Desertification Conference of the Parties, to establish such a repository and ensure universal access. This might be a contribution to it. Now, regarding, briefly, if I may, CSR. CSR for me is good, but it's just a good start, because the issue of degradation is structural. It's also about what countries account for as externalities. And unless we ensure that the countries and companies actually, and unless we ensure that companies are really bringing those so-called externalities into their balance sheet, CSR will just be a kind of good but charity attention to the issue.
Okay, thank you. Duncan, do you have any comments about the private sector issues and competition for land in the north as well? No.
I didn't really understand the question, actually. But since I've got the microphone, I want to apologize for not mentioning that IUCN was also part of that conference in Switzerland. If you could either repeat the question or else I'll pass to someone else because I didn't get it.
Would the person like to repeat the questions? It was about the impact of the private sector in the north. Yes?
So it was just about the, when you have food, fuel, and fiber companies competing for land, that can also be competing for, their displacement of their land use can actually impact the way land is used and abused in the south. And so what we found is that there's a lot of competition for this land. The sectors aren't talking to each other, and that actually has negative impacts worldwide. So it's, somebody else on the panel was nodding their head as I said, mentioned this. So,
Luke.
Anyway, that's what I meant.
That's why we need an SDG on land which will be universal, which will be therefore taken on by both developed and developing countries. When you consider that a country like Germany or even UK, well, they are doing quite well regarding food and other land-based, product. But bear in mind that their consumption patterns are driving outside of their country 80 million hectares of land use abroad. This might be driving degradation. So why do we ensure that this is rather on the restoration side and on the prevention side? Unless we have an SDG, attending to land as a global common, we will not make it.
Okay, very briefly, please, Duncan.
Yes, just with regard to the question about Brazil, my impression is that in Brazil you've actually got you've got a lot of ministries with a lot of capacity, but they're often not talking to each other. So if there's probably one good thing you could do in Brazil is to try to work out a way of getting them to work more coherently together, because I think you've probably got fantastic policies to prevent land degradation, but you've got others which are promoting land degradation effectively. And then with your question with regard to sugarcane, all I can say from the experiences we've had is that it's very important to protect those who are whistleblowing and who are saying that something's going wrong, and make sure that they don't suffer violence just for trying to do the right thing. And that's what we've seen in Mato Grosso del Sul, where traders which are supplying Coke and Pepsi have been involved in helping to fuel in conflicts between farmers and indigenous peoples. So that would be the single most important thing in my view.
Okay, I'm going to get the panel all to give us a quick wrap-up as we are drawing to a close, but we've got time for one more question for all of you. So I'm going to read the question out and then read it again and again. I'm sorry, you can only vote for one category. So after listening to the debate today, how should the issue of land degradation be addressed? A, should it be increased development assistance funding? B, improved technical support and exchange of best practices? Or C, political action at global level to prioritize the issue? So how should it best be addressed? Those in favor of increased development assistance funding, raise your hands. Those who think improved technical support and exchange of best practices is the solution. Right, probably about a dozen or slightly more. And those who think political action at global level to prioritize the issue. Overwhelming support there. Thank you very much, everyone. Well, we're coming to wrap up the session now. I have to just briefly summarize the main points, but before doing that, I just want to have 30 seconds from each of the panelists to say what is the way forward now as the solution to this problem, starting with you, Alexander.
My answer would have been A, B, and C, and most probably also D, because more action is needed. So my conclusion is the pressure on land will grow. That's very clear. And we need action at all levels, at the global level, at the national level, and the local level. And what we also need, and we have not addressed it until now, we need a different kind of science. We need science for the purposes of small-scale farmers also including the question of how to deal with scarce natural resources. So there's a new proposal for the next round of discussion, maybe in the afternoon. What kind of knowledge do we need? What kind of knowledge generation and knowledge dissemination do we really need so that we can really address the challenges of the future? Exactly 30 seconds.
Thank you. Excellent. Duncan.
Technically, with regard to targets and the post-2015 framework, I'd plead for a joined-up and coherent approach between those working on targets for land degradation and those who are working on targets for land tenure and land governance, because I think I don't think that's happening at the moment, and I think there's big potential. More broadly, I would just stress again that improving governance of land tenure is likely to be a massively important factor in addressing land degradation. And I would also say that somehow, love it or hate it, the performance of the private sector needs to take a quantum leap in the right direction, either through its own voluntary action or regulated, whichever one comes first and whichever one works best.
Thanks. You. Luke.
Well, thank you. First, landscape for me is the right scale for ensuring synergistic approaches and also assessing trade-off in making decisions. And therefore, we need government to understand landscape. And we also need a real global movement for landscape restoration. That's the scale where we can act. It's not just about restoring forests or restoring agricultural land. Unless we go landscape, we will not make it. And we need ministers of finance to understand that. We need ministers of commerce to understand that. And finally, the world is so keen about, eradicating rural poverty, ensuring food, water, and energy access for all, and as well as building resilience to climatic shocks. Why is it that the world is so slow to understand that it's about sustainable landscape management? We need to do something about that. And I do hope that though there are some, may I say, procrastination happening in the climate change process, but action on restoration, action on preventing degradation is the real world investment and the real world where we need to take action.
Thank you. And finally, Martin.
Thank you. I think we are at a very important point in time. We have the post-2015 development agenda ahead. There is the climate negotiation at a crucial point, but there are also still negotiations going on, trade negotiations under the Doha track. This we should use. But then, on the other hand, we should not wait for political frameworks. We should take action as fast and as good as we can. And many of those points have been mentioned during the discussion. I want to emphasize one. I think to achieve something, to have success, it's extremely important to support common people, the people living on the ground, civil society organizations dealing on a daily basis with land grabbing and with land degradation. And I think this is something that will eventually help us to pursue and achieve the objectives, and that will also help eventually to fight against corruption and all the other elements that are blocking sustainable development.
Thank you very much. So the panel, we all agreed that land was a neglected issue and a blind spot for many people, and we heard that 60% of complaints to the World Bank are about land. All the panel are agreed that land is a local and international issue and extremely complex. We discussed the SDG on land and soil degradation and the need for targets, and they could be as stringent as trying to restore land to the productivity of 2000. We need to have more science and more research. But before any of this, we also heard that Europe should get its own house in order, because the SDGs are universal, and if they can't agree themselves on land degradation, how can they preach to the developing world? We need policy coherence on development. And remember that the policies in the developed world should take into account the impact on the South. And another important point that came up was food waste. 30% of food is thrown away in the West, and so we need to take into account how we deal with food from the farm to the table. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this very interesting session, and the panel, you've all been very interesting. Thank you very much.